I was watching my favorite historical documentary in my own living room when my son-in-law Cameron marched in and yanked the power cord right out of the wall. "Enough of this trash," he said, looking down at me with pure disgust. "In this house, we watch smart things." I looked over at my daughter Natalie, hoping she would intervene. She just stood there, crossed her arms, and nodded. I did not yell. I did not argue. I quietly stood up, washed my teacup, and went upstairs. They thought they had broken me. The next evening, when they returned from work, they were pounding on the heavy oak doors, screaming until their throats went raw. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Calvin Pierce. I am 65 years old. I live in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts. For 40 years, I poured my sweat, my blood, and my soul into providing a flawless life for my family. But sitting at my own dining table on a cold Tuesday evening, I realized I had bred a parasite. The dining room was silent, except for the scrape of silverware against fine china. I had installed the marble countertops and the custom oak dining table with my own 2 hands decades ago. Now I sat at the very edge of it, feeling like an unwanted guest. Cameron pushed his plate away with a heavy sigh. The steak was perfectly cooked, but he looked at it as if it were an insult. He dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the plate. "This beef is incredibly tough," Cameron said. He did not look at me. He looked at my daughter Natalie. And there is that smell again. I cannot stand it anymore. It is that stale, dusty old person smell. It permeates the entire ground floor. I kept my eyes on my food. I chewed slowly. I waited for Natalie to say something. I waited for the daughter I had raised to defend her father. Natalie dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin. She did not look at me either. "Cameron is right, Dad. We need to talk about the living arrangements in this house. Cameron's consulting firm is expanding. He is bringing in high-profile clients. He cannot conduct business from the guest room anymore. He needs an executive office to project the right image." I placed my fork down. The coldness in her voice was palpable. "And what does that have to do with me?" I asked quietly. Natalie finally met my gaze. Her eyes held no warmth. "The master bedroom has the best natural lighting and the most floor space. It is exactly what Cameron needs for his firm. We think it is time for you to move down to the basement. It is completely finished. It has a bathroom. You will be out of the way, and it makes sense for the primary earners of the household to occupy the primary spaces." I stared at her. The master bedroom was the room I had shared with her mother until the day she died. It was the room where I had built the custom mahogany wardrobes. They wanted to banish me to the basement so Cameron could have a larger desk. Cameron leaned forward, resting his elbows on my oak table. He offered a condescending, pitying smile. "You had a good run, Calvin. You spent your life swinging hammers, putting up drywall, and fixing leaky pipes. You got incredibly lucky buying this plot of land back in the 80s, before Chestnut Hill became an exclusive, high-end neighborhood. But times have changed. This area requires a certain standard of living now. We are the future of this house. You need to accept your new reality and step aside." He called me a lucky carpenter. He genuinely believed I was just an old handyman who stumbled into a good zip code. He did not know the truth. He did not know that I did not just buy a plot of land. I founded Pierce Construction. I bought the entire valley when it was nothing but dirt and pine trees. I personally designed and built every luxury villa on this block. I essentially created Chestnut Hill. My signature was not just on the deed to this house. It was on the commercial lease of Cameron's supposedly successful consulting firm. But I did not say a word. I did not correct his arrogant delusion. True power does not need to justify itself to parasites. I simply wiped my mouth, stood up, and took my plate to the kitchen. My silence was not submission. It was observation. I needed to see exactly how far their greed would push them. The next morning, the real depth of their betrayal revealed itself. I woke up at 5 o'clock, a habit ingrained in me from decades of managing construction sites. The house was dead quiet. Natalie and Cameron never woke up before 8. I walked down to the kitchen to brew my morning coffee. When I opened the cabinet beneath the sink to throw away the used coffee filters, something caught my eye. Hidden beneath a layer of damp paper towels and food scraps were pieces of shredded, thick paper. I recognized the distinctive blue logo of my primary bank. I carefully pulled the trash bin out. I dug through the garbage, pulling out every shredded strip of paper I could find. I laid them out on the kitchen island. My hands remained perfectly steady as I pieced the torn documents together. It was a letter from my bank notifying me that 3 of my secondary credit cards had been abruptly canceled. The authorization signature at the bottom was forged. It was a sloppy imitation of my handwriting. I dug deeper into the trash. I found another envelope. This one was entirely intact. It was the monthly electricity bill for the house. For 40 years, that bill had arrived bearing the name Calvin Pierce. Now I stared at the bold black ink printed on the front. The bill was addressed to Cameron. The realization struck me with the force of a sledgehammer. This was not merely about wanting a bigger office. This was a calculated, methodical, legal theft. Cameron was canceling my lines of credit to isolate me financially. He was transferring the utility bills into his own name to establish legal residency and create a paper trail demonstrating that he was the head of the household. He was systematically erasing my existence from my own property. They were building a case. They were treating me like a squatter in the home I built for them. Any other man might have stormed upstairs, kicked down their bedroom door, and demanded an explanation. I did not. Anger is an emotion for the powerless. I am not powerless. I methodically collected every shredded piece of paper and sealed them in a plastic bag. I wiped down the kitchen counter, leaving no trace of my discovery. I took the bag upstairs to my bedroom and locked the door behind me. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I logged into my secure banking portal. I checked the transaction histories. I saw exactly where Cameron had attempted to reroute funds. He was testing the fences looking for vulnerabilities in my financial armor. He thought he was dealing with a technologically illiterate old man. He did not realize I had built corporate empires and navigated hostile takeovers before he was even born. I saved every digital log. I documented every forged request. My daughter and her husband had declared war on me, assuming I would simply surrender and fade into the shadows of the basement. I decided to let them keep their illusion a little longer. Let them feel victorious. The higher they climbed on their mountain of lies, the harder the fall would be. The absolute breaking point arrived that very evening. The house was cold. I sat in the living room resting in the old leather recliner that had been my only sanctuary for the past few months. I had turned the television on to a low volume watching a historical documentary. It was my quiet routine. It was the only space I occupied outside of my bedroom. I heard heavy footsteps descending the stairs. Cameron marched into the living room. He wore a crisp, expensive suit paid for by the allowance I had secretly provided to Natalie for years. His face was twisted into a scowl of pure annoyance. He did not say hello. He did not ask how my day was. He walked directly past me, grabbed the television power cord, and yanked it violently from the wall socket. The screen went completely black. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. "Enough of this trash," Cameron spat, dropping the cord onto the hardwood floor. He looked down at me with unvarnished disgust. "The noise is giving me a migraine. In this house, we watch smart things. We engage in intellectual pursuits. We do not waste electricity on mindless garbage." I slowly turned my head. Natalie had followed him downstairs. She stood in the doorway of the living room. I looked at her, searching her eyes for a shred of the little girl who used to sit on my lap and watch those same documentaries with me. I waited for her to tell her husband to show some respect. Natalie simply crossed her arms. She stared back at me with a blank, indifferent expression. She nodded in agreement with Cameron. "Cameron needs a quiet environment, Dad. You have to respect the rules of the house," she said. The rules of the house. My house. The house built with the money I earned standing on the foundation I poured. They had already convinced themselves that they were the masters and I was the burden. They had stripped away my authority, my credit cards, my utility bills, and now they were stripping away my basic right to exist comfortably in my own living room. Cameron smirked, waiting for me to react. He wanted an argument. He wanted me to yell, to lose my temper, to act like an unstable, irrational old man. He was desperate for me to give him an excuse to call the authorities or a doctor to further his agenda of taking control. I refused to give him that satisfaction. I stood up slowly. I picked up my empty teacup from the side table. I looked Cameron directly in the eyes. I did not show anger. I did not show fear. I showed absolutely nothing. I walked past him. I went to the kitchen sink and washed my teacup with meticulous care. I dried it with a towel and placed it back in the cupboard. Every movement was deliberate. Every action was a silent promise of the retribution that was coming. I walked back to the staircase. As I began to ascend the steps, I heard Cameron laugh softly. "See, you just have to be firm with him. He knows his place," Cameron muttered to Natalie. I reached the top of the stairs and walked down the hallway to the master bedroom, the room they wanted to steal from me. I stepped inside and closed the solid oak door. The heavy latch clicked into place, sealing me inside. I walked over to the large oil painting hanging above the fireplace. I pulled the frame aside, revealing the biometric steel safe embedded directly into the wall framing. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. The safe beeped, and the heavy steel door swung open. Inside sat the original property deeds, the corporate ownership documents, and the direct contact number for Vincent, the most ruthless corporate litigator in the entire state of Massachusetts. Cameron and Natalie wanted me out of their way. They wanted to take my home. They wanted to erase my legacy. They thought I was a naive, broken old man who would quietly retreat into the dark. They had no idea that I was about to shut the door on their entire existence. The time for silent observation was over. The time for the execution of my strategy had arrived. Tomorrow, they would learn the exact price of their arrogance. The heavy oak door of the master bedroom clicked shut behind me. The solid thud of the latch falling into place was the only sound in the room. I stood completely still for a moment, listening to the muffled, arrogant laughter of my son-in-law echoing from the bottom of the staircase. He genuinely thought he had won. He believed he had broken the spirit of a tired old carpenter. As the sound of his footsteps faded toward the kitchen, the stooped posture I had maintained downstairs simply melted away. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling the familiar tension release from my spine. I was not the frail, submissive burden they desperately wanted me to be. I was a man who had spent 40 years commanding construction sites, negotiating brutal union contracts, and building an empire from the ground up. The weak old man they saw in the living room was nothing more than a carefully constructed mirror designed to reflect their own blinding arrogance right back at them. I walked across the thick Persian rug toward the fireplace. Above the mantel hung a large framed oil painting of the Massachusetts coastline. Natalie had bought it for me a decade ago, back when she still looked at me with genuine affection rather than cold calculation. I reached out and gripped the edge of the ornate wooden frame. I pulled it smoothly to the left. The painting slid silently on a set of concealed custom-built tracks, revealing a solid wall of reinforced steel. I had personally installed this biometric safe during the initial framing of the house. No contractor knew about it. No architect had drawn it into the official blueprints. I pressed my right thumb against the digital scanner. A faint green light scanned my print, followed by the heavy, satisfying clack of the internal locking mechanism disengaging. I gripped the chrome handle and pulled the heavy door open. The cool air from inside the safe brushed against my skin. I reached in and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. It was heavy, carrying the physical weight of 4 decades of relentless labor. I carried the portfolio to my mahogany desk, turned on the small brass reading lamp, and sat down. The soft yellow light illuminated the crisp white pages as I opened the cover. Cameron thought he was a self-made genius. He loved to boast at dinner parties about how he had launched his elite consulting firm entirely on his own merit. He loved to tell his colleagues how he had secured a prime commercial lease in downtown Boston and a massive line of operating capital solely through his brilliant business plan. I stared at the documents spread out before me. 3 years ago, Cameron had been drowning in debt and facing a wall of rejected loan applications. No bank would touch him. His business plan was arrogant, his projections were wildly inflated, and his personal credit was overextended. Natalie had come to me in tears, terrified that her husband's dreams were crashing down around them. I could not stand to see my daughter cry. I contacted the regional director of my primary lending institution, a man who had financed every major subdivision I had ever built. I made a silent, strictly confidential arrangement. I put up my own unencumbered assets as collateral. I signed my name as the absolute guarantor for Cameron's entire commercial lease and his initial $500,000 business loan. The bank suddenly approved his applications, citing a mysterious angel investor who believed in his vision. Cameron never questioned his sudden stroke of incredible luck. His ego was too massive to consider that someone else had paved his road to success. He assumed his own brilliance had finally been recognized. I flipped to the next page in the portfolio. It was the original master deed to the Chestnut Hill estate. The paper was pristine. My name, Calvin Pierce, was the only name printed on the document. Cameron had spent the evening mocking me as a lucky handyman who had stumbled into a good zip code. He did not know that I had purchased the original 200 acres of this valley before the first paved road was ever laid down. I did not just buy a house in a wealthy neighborhood. I developed the neighborhood. I sold the surrounding lots to doctors, lawyers, and executives maintaining the absolute best, most secluded acre for my own family. The house we lived in was my masterpiece, built to withstand anything. I had kept my wealth entirely liquid and invisible to them, because I wanted Natalie to marry a man who valued hard work, not a massive trust fund. I wanted to give them the dignity of building their own lives, backed by a silent safety net that would catch them if they ever truly fell. Now looking at the signatures on the guarantee contracts, that safety net felt like a weapon they had stolen to bludgeon me. I traced my finger over the specific clauses I had demanded my lawyers include in the guarantor agreement. I had the absolute, unchallengeable legal right to withdraw my financial backing at any moment, for any reason, without requiring any prior notice to the borrower. The moment I formally revoked my signature, the bank would immediately call in the entire balance of the loan. Cameron's commercial lease would be voided within 24 hours. His assets would be frozen, and his business would instantly collapse into total bankruptcy. I had built his entire arrogant world, and I held the absolute power to dismantle it with a single phone call. I felt no joy in this realization. A heavy, suffocating sadness settled in my chest. I had spent my entire life trying to be a shield for my family. I had paid their debts, secured their housing, and swallowed their daily insults, because I believed that patience and unconditional love would eventually break through their selfishness. I thought that by staying small, by making myself invisible, I was giving them the room they needed to grow. But my silence had not made them grateful. It had only made them cruel. They had mistaken my quiet humility for weakness. They had looked at my patience and seen an opportunity for exploitation. Cameron unplugging my television and treating me like a stray dog in my own home was not just an act of disrespect. It was a declaration of absolute ownership over a life that did not belong to him. I turned the page and looked at a separate stack of papers I had salvaged from the kitchen trash earlier that morning. I smoothed out the wrinkled, shredded strips I had taped back together. It was a formal request for medical power of attorney. Cameron was not just trying to take over the utility bills to establish residency. He was actively communicating with an estate lawyer to have me legally declared mentally incompetent. He wanted to strip away my basic human rights, throw me into a locked facility, and take total control of my assets to cover his own hidden financial failures. He wanted to erase my mind, my dignity, and my freedom, all so he could have a bigger office and a fatter bank account. The sadness in my chest hardened into something entirely different. It turned into a cold, unbreakable resolve. The father who had silently endured their abuse died the moment Cameron yanked that power cord from the wall. The man sitting at the mahogany desk was the architect of their entire existence. They wanted to steal my home and lock me away. They had crossed the final boundary, pushing our relationship past the point of any possible reconciliation. There would be no more second chances. There would be no more silent subsidies. There would only be absolute, undeniable consequences. I reached for my phone resting on the corner of the desk. The screen illuminated the dark wood surface. I looked at the time. It was late, but the man I was about to call did not care about the hour when it came to his most lucrative clients. I found the contact for Vincent. He was the sharpest, most relentless corporate litigator in the city. He did not negotiate. He annihilated opposition. I had kept him on retainer for 20 years for exactly this kind of catastrophic scenario. I pressed the call button. The line rang twice before a deep, calm voice answered. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I spoke with the firm, commanding tone I had used to run my business empire. Vincent, we are executing the total withdrawal protocols immediately. Revoke my guarantor status on the commercial lease and the business loan. Freeze every secondary credit line associated with my accounts. Furthermore, I need you to draft an emergency eviction notice for the occupants of my residence. They have exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises before they are treated as hostile trespassers. I listened to the brief silence on the other end of the line. Vincent did not ask why. He simply confirmed the instructions. I hung up the phone and placed it carefully back on the desk. I looked at the safe, then at the documents that held the absolute destruction of Cameron's pathetic, fabricated life. I had spent years building a comfortable fortress for my family to thrive in. Starting tomorrow, they would discover what happens when the architect decides to lock the doors and tear the foundation right out from under their feet. The silent adjustment was over. The complete dismantling was about to begin. The heavy steel door of the safe remained open, casting a faint metallic gleam across my mahogany desk. I had the original property deeds and the corporate ownership documents safely laid out, but my focus shifted entirely to the plastic bag of shredded paper I had salvaged from the kitchen trash. I arranged the jagged strips next to the glowing screen of my laptop. I logged into my secure banking portal and began cross-referencing the account numbers Cameron had foolishly tried to reroute. It took me less than 20 minutes to unravel the pathetic reality of my son-in-law. Cameron was not a brilliant business strategist expanding his elite consulting firm. He was a desperate gambler wearing a tailored suit. I pulled up the commercial lease agreements I had secretly guaranteed. Attached to those records were automated financial health flags from the bank. Cameron had leveraged his initial operating capital into high-risk margin trading. He had gambled on volatile tech stocks and lost catastrophically. The numbers on the screen were glaring red. He was drowning in a margin debt exceeding $800,000. The bank was preparing to issue a final margin call by the end of the month. If he did not produce the cash, they would liquidate his firm and seize his personal assets. He was backed into a corner completely out of options. That explained his sudden, aggressive push to claim my master bedroom. He needed to establish absolute dominance in the household to execute his ultimate survival strategy. I pieced together the final torn document from the trash bin. It was not a bank statement. It was a legal draft from a shady probate attorney in downtown Boston. I read the bold black text at the top of the page. It was a formal petition for emergency medical guardianship. My eyes scanned the fabricated claims Cameron had submitted to the courts. He testified under penalty of perjury that I was suffering from severe cognitive decline. He claimed I was a danger to myself, that I regularly forgot where I was, and that I lacked the mental capacity to manage my own vast estate. He formally requested that the state grant him absolute legal authority over my medical decisions and my financial portfolio. The sheer malice of the document chilled my blood. He did not just want to steal the house I built to pay off his gambling debts. He wanted to strip away my basic human rights. He wanted the legal power to lock me inside a memory care facility, drug me into submission, and liquidate my life as work while I wasted away in a sterile room. I looked toward the bedroom door. Down the hall, my daughter Natalie was sleeping soundly next to the man, plotting my total destruction. She had stood in the living room and watched him unplug my television with a smirk. She knew. She was entirely complicit in the plan to erase her own father. The last lingering trace of paternal hesitation vanished from my heart. I was no longer a father dealing with a rebellious child. I was a property owner dealing with hostile intruders. I reached for my phone resting on the corner of the desk. The illuminated clock on the screen read 2 a.m. I scrolled through my encrypted contacts and found the private cell phone number for Vincent. He was the most ruthless corporate litigator in Boston. I had retained his services for decades, utilizing his aggressive tactics to crush rival developers and clear hostile zoning disputes. Vincent did not sleep when there was blood in the water. I pressed the call button. The line rang exactly twice before he answered. His voice was crisp, alert, and strictly professional. I did not waste time with pleasantries. Vincent. I said, keeping my voice low but absolute. We are executing a total financial withdrawal immediately. Cameron has breached the terms of our silent arrangement. I want my signature removed as the guarantor for his commercial lease and his business loans before the banks open this morning. Expose him to the margin call. I want every secondary credit line associated with his firm instantly frozen. Vincent did not ask for an explanation. He simply typed rapidly on a keyboard in the background. Consider it done, Calvin, Vincent replied. The banks will sever his lifelines by dawn. What about the Chestnut Hill property? I looked down at the forged guardianship petition. I want you to draft an emergency eviction notice, I instructed. Cameron and Natalie are no longer residents of my home. They are illegal trespassers attempting to commit real estate fraud. Serve the eviction notice directly to his office today. Give them exactly 24 hours to remove their personal belongings from my property. If they refuse, we involve the police. Understood, Vincent said smoothly. The legal strike will be devastating and absolute. They will have nowhere to hide. I ended the call and placed the phone back on the desk. The trap was set. The safety net I had held under them for years was gone. Tomorrow Cameron would walk into his office expecting to rule his imaginary empire. Instead, he would find the ground completely removed from beneath his feet. I turned off the brass reading lamp and sat in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise. The sun had not yet breached the horizon when I stepped out the front door of my Chestnut Hill home. The crisp morning air bit at my face, offering a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. Upstairs, Cameron and Natalie were still asleep. They were wrapped in luxury linens I had paid for, completely unaware that the foundation of their arrogant lives was already crumbling. I did not take my usual heavy-duty truck. I took the sleek sedan I rarely drove, keeping the engine noise to a bare whisper. Every single second counted now. I drove toward the financial district with a singular, icy focus. My mind was sharp. It was stripped entirely of the fatherly guilt and the misplaced patience that had clouded my judgment for the past 3 years. They wanted a war. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. I was bringing them absolute devastation. I arrived at the main branch of my bank 20 minutes before it officially opened to the public. The security guard standing behind the glass recognized me immediately. He unlocked the heavy doors without asking a single question. I did not wait in the lobby like an ordinary customer. I walked directly to the executive offices on the top floor. I knew this building intimately. I had poured the concrete for the vault below our feet 30 years ago. The regional manager, a sharp man named Gregory, stood up the moment I entered his office. He saw the cold expression on my face and immediately walked over to close his office blinds. I sat across from him and placed my hands flat on his polished wood desk. "Freeze every line of credit attached to my primary accounts," I ordered. "Revoke all authorized user privileges immediately." Gregory did not hesitate. His fingers flew across his keyboard. Within seconds, the gold and platinum cards sitting in Cameron's expensive leather wallet became entirely useless pieces of plastic. I watched the confirmation screens pop up one by one. For 3 years, those accounts had funded Cameron's massive illusion of success. They had paid for his tailored suits, his lavish client dinners, and the extravagant anniversary trips he claimed to have financed through his sheer business brilliance. I had let him play the role of the highly successful executive because I wanted my daughter to feel secure. That security had morphed into a sense of entitlement so profound it made them completely blind to reality. Now the illusion was dead, but Gregory did not smile. He stopped typing and looked at me with a deep, unsettling hesitation. The color drained slightly from his face. "Calvin," he said, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper, "you arrived just in time, but we have a massive problem." He turned his heavy monitor toward me so I could see the screen. My eyes scanned the digital document displayed on the bright display. It was a formal request for a complete wire transfer of my primary liquid assets. The amount was staggering. It was enough to cover Cameron's massive margin calls and leave him with a highly comfortable fortune. And at the bottom of the request was a notarized power of attorney. The sheer audacity of the document hit me like a physical blow. The paperwork granted Cameron absolute financial control over my entire estate. The justification listed on the second page was severe cognitive decline and medical incapacitation. The signature at the bottom was a flawless forgery. It was vastly superior to the clumsy, shredded attempt I had found in the kitchen trash the day before. Cameron had not just been planning to steal from me. He had already pulled the trigger. Gregory looked at me with genuine alarm. "This was submitted through an online corporate portal late yesterday evening," he explained. "It is scheduled to clear automatically at the opening of the business day. That is exactly 14 minutes from now. My legal department flagged it for secondary review simply because of the massive volume, but on paper, this document looks completely airtight. If you had not walked through those doors right now, the automated system would have processed the transfer. You would have been wiped out." Cameron was not waiting for a court to approve his fabricated medical claims. He had clearly hired a professional forger to bypass the legal system entirely. He intended to drain my life savings by breakfast and leave me penniless before I even realized I was under attack. The anger I felt was absolute, cold, and razor-sharp. I looked at the clock on Gregory's wall. 13 minutes remained. "Cancel the transfer," I said, my voice dangerously steady. "Flag the document as a confirmed fraudulent submission." Gregory typed frantically, overriding the automated clearing process. The pending transfer vanished from the screen. "Lock the entire cash reserve down," I continued. "Require my physical in-person biometric verification for any withdrawal exceeding $100. No digital transfers. No phone authorizations. Nothing moves without my physical presence and my thumbprint on your scanner." Gregory executed the commands, locking my wealth behind an impenetrable digital wall. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the reality of the situation demanded a much harsher response. Cameron had committed felony bank fraud. I could have told Gregory to call the federal authorities right then. I could have had police waiting at Cameron's office to arrest him the moment he arrived. But a simple, quiet arrest was too clean. It was far too easy. Cameron needed to feel the absolute terror of his crumbling empire before the handcuffs snapped shut. He needed to watch his reputation disintegrate in real time. "Do not alert him that the transfer was blocked," I told Gregory. "Let his internal system show the request is still pending. Let him believe he has won. Let him walk into his office today thinking he is a millionaire. When his desperate creditors attempt to pull the funds to cover his gambling debts, let the checks bounce so hard they shatter his entire company. Gregory nodded, fully understanding the magnitude of the counterstrike. The financial guillotine was now swinging down, and Cameron had his neck positioned perfectly on the block. I stood up from the heavy leather chair. My financial assets were secured, but the battle was far from over. Cameron had proven he was willing to forge federal documents and steal millions to save his own skin. He was a desperate man, and desperate men are incredibly dangerous. I had to secure the physical fortress. I thanked Gregory and walked out of the bank. The morning sun was just beginning to hit the glass facades of the downtown buildings. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from Vincent, my attorney. The eviction notices were finalized and the private security contractors were standing by. I got into my car and gripped the steering wheel. The race against time had dramatically shifted. Cameron would soon try to buy his morning coffee and realize his credit cards were dead. Within a few hours, he would realize his fraudulent wire transfer had failed to clear. When that happened, his arrogant confidence would shatter into pure panic. He would rush back to Chestnut Hill to confront the frail television-watching old man he thought he could easily intimidate. He would expect to find an easy victim cowering in the living room. Instead, he was going to find a fortress of solid steel and a father who had finally stopped holding back. I put the car in gear and drove toward my home, ready to permanently lock the gates on the parasites. The air in the private dining room of the downtown Boston steakhouse smelled of aged leather and expensive bourbon. Cameron sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table, feeling completely untouchable. Across from him sat two senior executives from a burgeoning tech firm. They had just verbally agreed to a massive consulting contract. Cameron leaned back in his chair and swirled the remaining amber liquid in his crystal glass. He wore a bespoke Italian suit that draped perfectly over his shoulders. He projected absolute power and endless wealth. He signaled the waiter with a subtle, confident flick of his wrist. The waiter arrived promptly and placed the sleek black leather folio next to Cameron. Without breaking eye contact with his clients, Cameron reached into his tailored breast pocket and extracted his heavy metal corporate card. He dropped it onto the tray with a satisfying clack. He continued telling a story about a recent weekend trip to Martha's Vineyard, painting a picture of a man who belonged to the elite upper echelon of society. He expected the waiter to return swiftly, with a pen and a polite smile. Instead, the waiter returned 3 minutes later with a stiff posture. He did not place the folio on the table. He stepped close to Cameron and leaned down, his voice dropping to a discreet, agonizingly clear whisper. "I am terribly sorry, sir, but this card has been declined." Cameron stopped mid-sentence. He felt a sudden sharp spike of irritation. He offered a practiced, dismissive chuckle to the tech executives. He waved his hand in the air. "The fraud detection algorithms at these banks are incredibly overzealous," he told them. He reached back into his wallet. He pulled out a platinum credit card and handed it to the waiter. "Run this one." The executives nodded politely, but the celebratory energy in the room had fractured. Cameron took a sip of water. His pulse ticked slightly faster. The waiter reappeared a moment later. His face was entirely devoid of emotion. "I apologize again, sir. That card has also been declined by the issuer." The silence that fell over the table was absolute. The two executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them checked his expensive watch and cleared his throat. Cameron felt a cold sweat break out along the back of his neck. The bill was nearly $900. He dug frantically into his wallet. His fingers brushed past dead plastic until he found his personal debit card. It was an account he barely used, tied to his checking balance. He shoved it at the waiter. When the payment finally cleared, the damage was already done. The tech executives stood up, offering tight, formal handshakes. They muttered polite excuses about upcoming meetings. They did not mention the contract as they walked out the door. Cameron stood alone in the private dining room. His jaw was clenched so tightly his teeth ached. He stormed out of the restaurant and marched down the bustling Boston sidewalk. The bitter wind off the harbor bit through his expensive suit. He rode the elevator up to the 30th floor of his office building. He walked past the receptionist without a word. He entered his massive corner office and slammed the glass door shut. The panoramic view of the city usually filled him with a sense of conquering pride. Today, the glass walls felt like a transparent cage. He threw his suit jacket onto the leather sofa and grabbed his desk phone. He dialed the elite client services number for his primary banking institution. He bypassed the automated menus, punching in his priority access code. A representative answered immediately. Cameron did not wait for an introduction. He barked his demands into the receiver. "This is Cameron Davis. I need to speak with Gregory in the executive branch right now. You have a catastrophic system failure on your end, and you just humiliated me in front of a major client." The voice on the other end of the line was crisp and unnervingly calm. "Gregory is currently unavailable, sir. I am a senior analyst with the Fraud and Security Division. How may I assist you?" Cameron paced behind his massive desk. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up. "Do not play games with me. Every single one of my corporate and secondary cards was just declined. I want the security lock lifted this exact second, or I am moving my entire portfolio to a competitor by the end of the day." There was a brief pause on the line. The quiet tapping of a keyboard echoed through the receiver. "Sir, looking at the accounts associated with your name, there is no security lock on the cards. The accounts have not been frozen by our fraud department. The secondary user privileges for Cameron Davis have been permanently revoked by the primary account holder." Cameron stopped pacing. The blood drained from his face. The air in the office suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He gripped the edge of his desk. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave. "That is my firm. Those are my accounts. I submitted a legally binding notarized power of attorney through the secure portal late last night, granting me absolute administrative control over the entire estate. Process that document right now." The analyst did not flinch. "We are fully aware of the document submitted to our portal last night, sir. That document was flagged by our legal department upon arrival. Furthermore, the primary account holder, Mr. Calvin Pierce, stood in our main lobby at dawn this morning. He physically verified his identity using our biometric scanners. He personally executed the revocation of all your privileges. He also placed a total lockdown on the liquid assets. Nothing can be transferred without his physical thumbprint." Cameron felt his knees go weak. He sank heavily into his ergonomic leather chair. The world outside his window seemed to tilt entirely off its axis. The old man knew. The quiet, pathetic carpenter he had mocked in the living room just 12 hours ago had not gone to sleep in defeat. Calvin had walked into the bank and systematically dismantled Cameron's entire financial existence. The analyst continued speaking, dealing the final lethal blow. "Furthermore, sir, because the primary account holder has severed his guarantor status. The bank is currently reviewing the commercial lease for your office space, as well as the outstanding balance of your business loans. Given your current margin debt in the market, the automated system is preparing to issue a final margin call. If you cannot provide the liquidity to cover the deficit, your firm will be forced into immediate liquidation." Cameron dropped the phone. The receiver bounced against the polished wood of his desk, the analyst's voice turning into a tinny, distant buzz. He stared blindly at the wall. The flawless image he had projected to the world was a complete lie funded entirely by the man he had tried to throw into the basement. Without Calvin's secret backing, Cameron was nothing. He was worse than nothing. He was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt with no way out. The power of attorney he had paid a criminal to forge was useless. He was exposed. Panic, raw and absolute, seized his throat. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The walls of the office were closing in. The prestigious consulting firm, the bespoke suits, the luxury cars, all of it was evaporating into thin air. He snatched his cell phone from his pocket. His hands shook violently as he fumbled through his contacts. He found Natalie's name and hit dial. He pressed the phone to his ear, listening to the agonizingly slow ringing. He needed his wife. He needed her to go downstairs right now and fix this. He needed her to beg the old man to reverse the damage before the bank seized everything. Natalie answered on the third ring. Her voice was cheerful, completely unaware of the apocalypse unfolding downtown. Natalie Cameron gasped. His voice was cracked and breathless. He sounded like a man drowning. You need to find your father right this second. The facade is gone. He went to the bank. He knows about the accounts. He knows about the documents. He just cut all our lifelines. We have absolutely nothing left. I drove back into Chestnut Hill just as the neighborhood landscaping crews were starting their morning routines. The manicured lawns and quiet streets looked exactly as they did every other day, projecting an image of absolute peace and untouchable wealth. I pulled my sedan into my long sweeping driveway and parked near the entrance. I did not go inside immediately. I waited in the crisp morning air. Less than 10 minutes later, 3 unmarked black utility vans turned off the main road and pulled through my gates. I did not hire a standard residential alarm company. I needed a team that understood commercial fortification. The men who stepped out of the vans were the heavy security contractors I used to secure high-risk construction sites in downtown Boston. The foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus, walked up the driveway to meet me. He had worked under my command 20 years ago as a rough carpenter before starting his own security firm. He knew my standards. He knew I did not tolerate delays. I handed him a rolled blueprint of the estate. I told him I needed the perimeter rendered absolutely impenetrable by noon. He looked at my face, saw the severity in my eyes, and simply nodded. He signaled his men, and the quiet neighborhood was instantly shattered by the sound of industrial drills and heavy equipment. They moved through my home with military precision. They did not just rekey the exterior doors. They ripped the heavy brass deadbolts and the decorative lock sets straight out of the solid mahogany frames. The splintering wood echoed through the foyer. In their place, they wired flush-mounted biometric scanners and heavy-duty magnetic strike plates. The electronic mechanisms locked into the door frames with a brutal, heavy click. The doors would no longer open with a metal key. They would only respond to the unique ridge patterns of my right thumb and the specific retinal scan of my eye. While the locksmiths dismantled the entryways, a specialized glazing crew moved along the perimeter of the ground floor. My late wife had loved the large traditional glass panes because they let the morning light flood into the living room. It broke my heart slightly to alter them, but necessity outweighed sentimentality. The crew systematically removed the fragile decorative glass. They installed commercial-grade shatterproof polycarbonate panels into the reinforced frames. A desperate man with a sledgehammer could swing at those windows all day long and only walk away with exhausted arms and a cracked handle. I watched my home, the open and welcoming sanctuary I had built to raise my family, transform into a hardened vault. It was becoming a steel fortress, hidden behind a facade of brick and ivy. While the crew secured the outer shell of the house, I went to work on the interior. I walked up the grand staircase and entered the master bedroom. The space Cameron had so eagerly claimed for his new executive office was about to be completely purged. I brought up a stack of heavy-duty cardboard moving boxes from the basement. I started with my son-in-law. I opened his side of the custom wardrobe. I took his tailored Italian suits off their cedar hangers. I folded them and dropped them into the cardboard boxes. I packed his expensive watches, his designer leather shoes, and his silk ties. I felt absolutely no anger as I touched his belongings. I felt only the cold, mechanical efficiency of a foreman clearing hazardous debris from a job site. He was a trespasser, and his presence was being eradicated. Then I moved to Natalie's side of the room. This was entirely different. I opened her jewelry box. I saw the small pearl necklace I had bought for her 16th birthday resting next to a massive diamond bracelet Cameron had purchased with my secretly subsidized money. I picked up a silver-framed photograph from her nightstand. It was a picture of the two of us from her college graduation. She was smiling brightly, holding her diploma tightly against her chest, leaning her head against my shoulder. I stared at the image of the girl I had raised. I wondered exactly when she had traded her soul for the empty illusion of high society status. I wondered when the daughter who used to help me sand wooden cabinets in the garage had decided her father was a disposable asset. I placed the photograph face down at the very bottom of a box. I packed her silk dresses, her designer cosmetics, and her expensive shoes. I sealed each heavy box with thick strips of shipping tape. I dragged the boxes down the hallway one by one. I carried them down the stairs and pushed them out the front door. I stacked 12 heavy cardboard boxes neatly on the edge of the front porch, exposed to the cold morning air. The security crew was just finishing the final wiring on the front door reinforcement. The house was now an impenetrable block of stone and steel. My phone chimed in my pocket. It was a secure email notification from Vincent. He had attached the emergency eviction mandate and the formal restraining order. A superior court judge had signed the documents just 20 minutes prior, based on the documented evidence of financial fraud and the forged power of attorney. I walked into my home office and printed the documents on thick, heavy paper. I walked out to the front porch one last time. I used a heavy industrial staple gun to attach the thick legal packet directly to the center of the new reinforced front door. The bold black text explicitly forbade Cameron and Natalie from stepping foot on the property. It outlined the immediate legal consequences of attempting to breach the perimeter. I thanked Marcus, paid his crew their premium rate in cash, and watched their black vans pull out of the driveway. The heavy wrought iron gates at the end of the property rolled shut automatically, locking into place with a loud mechanical clank. I stood in my foyer. The house was completely silent. The faint scent of ozone and freshly cut metal hung in the air from the morning's labor. I walked into the living room and sat down in my old leather recliner. I did not turn on the television. I did not make a cup of tea. I simply sat in the quiet, looking at the glowing red light of the biometric lock on the front door. The financial accounts were frozen. The physical perimeter was sealed. The legal snare was fully deployed. Now I just had to wait in the silence for the wolves to realize they had been locked out in the cold. The sky above Chestnut Hill bruised into a deep, violent purple as the late afternoon bled into evening. Heavy moisture-laden clouds rolled over the tree line, swallowing the remaining sunlight and casting long, sharp shadows across my manicured lawn. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying the distinct metallic scent of an approaching storm. Inside the house, the atmosphere was a perfect vacuum, sealed contrast to the turbulent weather. The silence was absolute. I sat in the center of the living room in my worn leather recliner, my hands resting calmly on the armrests. I did not turn on the lamps. I simply watched the sprawling front lawn through the newly installed polycarbonate window panes. The trap had been set, the perimeter hardened, and the legal snare pulled completely tight. All that remained was the inevitable arrival of the prey. The sudden violent screech of tires tearing across asphalt shattered the neighborhood's pristine quiet. A silver luxury sedan careened around the corner and took the turn into my driveway, far too fast, the rear tires catching the edge of the manicured grass and tearing up a thick chunk of sod. The car slammed to a halt just inches from the garage doors. The engine was instantly killed, and the driver's side door was thrown open with reckless force. Cameron climbed out. The flawless, untouchable executive who had strutted out of this house that morning was entirely gone. His bespoke Italian suit jacket was wrinkled and unbuttoned, hanging awkwardly off his shoulders. His silk tie was violently loosened, and his collar was torn open as if he had spent the afternoon gasping for air. His face was a sickly ashen gray, slick with a thick layer of cold sweat. He moved with the erratic, jerky motions of a man whose entire reality had just been liquidated. He slammed the car door shut and practically lunged toward the front walkway. Natalie emerged from the passenger side a moment later. She moved much slower, her face twisted in a mask of profound confusion and rising alarm. She carried her expensive designer handbag, clutching it tightly against her chest as she hurried to keep pace with her husband's frantic march. She did not know about the margin calls. She did not know about the forged power of attorney or the massive federal crimes her husband had attempted to commit while she slept. She only knew that Cameron had called her in a state of absolute unhinged panic, demanding she drop everything and return to the estate immediately. I watched them through the reinforced glass, feeling the steady, calm rhythm of my own heartbeat. They marched up the flagstone path, their expensive leather shoes clicking rapidly against the stone. As they reached the base of the wide front steps, their momentum suddenly faltered. Cameron stopped dead in his tracks. Natalie bumped into his shoulder, letting out a sharp gasp as her eyes followed his gaze. Lined up with geometric precision across the expansive front porch were 12 heavy-duty cardboard moving boxes. They were sealed tightly with industrial shipping tape, standing like a wall of silent sentinels guarding the entrance. For a long, heavy moment, neither of them moved. The wind picked up, whipping through the pine trees and rustling the expensive fabric of Natalie's dress. I watched the gears turning in Cameron's mind as he stared at the boxes. He saw the designer logos on the custom garment bags sticking out of the top flaps. He saw the shape of his expensive shoeboxes. The reality of his eviction was sitting right in front of his eyes, yet his arrogant mind violently rejected the information. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath, and pushed past the boxes. He refused to believe he had lost. He stormed up the remaining steps and marched directly to the heavy oak front door. He reached into his pocket with trembling fingers and yanked out his heavy gold keychain. He thrust his hand forward, aiming the brass key toward the familiar deadbolt he had used for years. His hand slammed violently against solid, unyielding wood. The brass key scraped uselessly against the thick oak paneling. Cameron froze. He stepped back, blinking rapidly, his chest heaving as he stared at the door. The heavy brass lock set the deadbolt, the ornate handle. They were completely gone. The door was perfectly smooth, save for a sleek, matte, black, rectangular device flush-mounted directly into the wood framing. The biometric scanner emitted a single steady red laser line waiting for a fingerprint. It would never again accept. Panic, absolute and untethered, seized control of Cameron's body. He dropped his keys. They clattered loudly against the stone porch. He slapped his hands flat against the heavy oak door, pushing with his entire body weight, grunting like a cornered animal. The door did not yield a single millimeter. The custom magnetic strike plates held the frame with industrial bone-crushing force. He grabbed the edges of the scanner, trying to pry it from the wood with his bare fingernails. He was gasping for air, his perfectly styled hair falling into his wild, terrified eyes. Natalie rushed up the steps, her voice piercing the heavy air. "Cameron, what is happening? What did he do to the door? Where is the lock?" Cameron ignored her. He was hyperventilating, his hands slapping uselessly against the fortified wood. "Open the door," he screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate wail. "Open this door right now." It was then that his frantic, bloodshot eyes finally registered the thick packet of legal documents. I had used a high-powered staple gun to secure the papers directly at eye level, right in the center of the door. The wind fluttered the edges of the heavy stock paper, drawing his attention to the bold, uncompromising black text. Cameron stopped hitting the door. He leaned in his chest, rising and falling rapidly as he read the words. It was an emergency eviction mandate and a strict judge-ordered restraining order. It explicitly detailed his unauthorized financial maneuvers, the revocation of his guarantor status, and the immediate termination of his residency. The document commanded him to vacate the premises immediately, or face criminal trespassing charges. Natalie leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the legal text. She let out a sharp, horrified cry. "What is this, Cameron? What does it mean that your lease is revoked? What did you do to the bank accounts? Why does it say you tried to steal his money?" Cameron spun around. His face contorted into an ugly, terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The suave, intellectual consultant had been completely eradicated. He was nothing but a desperate thief who had just realized the vault was empty and the exit was sealed. He let out a guttural roar, a sound completely devoid of human reason, and charged toward the large living room windows. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, watching him sprint directly toward the glass that separated us. He stopped at the large concrete planter, resting beneath the windowsill. He reached down and hoisted a massive, jagged, decorative landscaping stone with both hands. His veins bulged against his neck. He raised the heavy stone above his head, aiming directly for the center of the glass pane, intending to shatter his way into my sanctuary. Natalie screamed, covering her face with her hands. Cameron swung his arms downward with catastrophic force, hurling the stone directly at the window. He braced himself for the explosive sound of shattering glass. He fully expected the window to explode inward, showering my living room with deadly shards. Instead, the heavy stone slammed into the commercial-grade polycarbonate panel with a dull, pathetic thud. The advanced material absorbed the immense kinetic impact instantly. The stone simply bounced off the reinforced surface and fell harmlessly into the bushes below. The window did not crack. It did not splinter. It did not even vibrate. Cameron stood frozen, staring at the flawless, unbroken pane of glass. He looked down at his empty hands, completely unable to process the physical reality of his failure. He took a step closer, pressing his face against the cold polycarbonate. Through the glass, his bloodshot, terrified eyes finally met mine. I was sitting only a few feet away, obscured slightly by the growing shadows of the living room. I did not move. I did not blink. I looked at him with the cold, absolute finality of a judge delivering a life sentence. He saw the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of my chest. He saw that I was not a frail, confused old man waiting to be discarded into a basement. I was the architect of his destruction, sitting comfortably inside an impenetrable fortress, watching him drown in the storm of his own creation. He slapped his bloody palms against the glass, screaming my name over and over again. His voice was muffled and distorted by the thick insulation. He begged. He threatened. He demanded I let him in. He promised to fix the money. He promised to withdraw the guardianship papers. He offered 1,000 desperate lies, trying to bargain his way back into the life he had so casually attempted to steal. I remained entirely silent. My gaze shifted slowly from Cameron's weeping, pathetic face to my daughter. Natalie stood near the porch steps, the wind whipping her hair across her tear-streaked face. She was staring at me through the glass, her eyes wide with shock, betrayal, and a deep, crushing sorrow. She mouthed the word, "Dad," her hands reaching out toward the window. A profound, heavy ache settled deep within my bones. This was the child I had carried on my shoulders. This was the girl I had built this empire to protect. But she had chosen her allegiance. She had stood by in silence while a parasite tried to erase my existence. Love without boundaries is simply an invitation for abuse, and I refused to be a victim in my own home. I looked at my daughter, holding her gaze for a long, painful moment. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, I reached up and pulled the heavy velvet curtains shut, severing our connection and plunging the living room into darkness. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall against the polycarbonate glass, matching the furious, useless pounding of Cameron's fists. The storm had finally broken over Chestnut Hill, and they were locked entirely on the outside. The heavy impacts against the reinforced front door echoed through the silent foyer like cannon fire. Cameron was no longer knocking. He was launching his entire body weight against the solid oak paneling. The dull, rhythmic thuds vibrated through the floorboards, a physical manifestation of his unraveling sanity. I sat perfectly still in the darkness of my home office. My desk was illuminated only by the cool blue glow of the security monitors. The high-definition cameras captured every desperate, pathetic movement on the front porch. The polished, arrogant consulting executive was dead. In his place was a feral, cornered animal. Cameron kicked the base of the door with the heel of his expensive leather shoe. He kicked it until the leather scuffed and tore. He hammered his fists against the wood until his knuckles split open, leaving bright smears of blood on the pristine white paint of the doorframe. The wind whipped his hair into a chaotic mess. The first heavy sheets of rain from the incoming storm began to lash across the porch, soaking his custom-tailored suit. He did not care. He was consumed by a blind, destructive rage. "Open this door!" Cameron roared. His voice was hoarse and cracking under the strain. "You cannot do this to me. I live here. This is my house. Open the door right now, or I swear to God I will tear it off its hinges." He was screaming empty threats at a fortress of steel and polycarbonate. He grabbed the sleek black biometric scanner mounted on the frame and tried to rip it from the brickwork with his bare, bleeding hands. The device did not yield a fraction of an inch. He slammed his open palms against the unyielding surface and let out a guttural scream of pure frustration. He was a man who had spent his entire life manipulating his way into power, and he had finally encountered a wall he could neither charm nor bully his way through. Natalie stepped into the frame of the security camera. She had been standing back, shivering in the cold wind, clutching her designer handbag, as if it were a shield. But as Cameron's physical assault on the house proved utterly useless, her initial shock mutated into a toxic, burning entitlement. She pushed her soaked hair out of her eyes and marched up to the door. She shoved Cameron aside and began pounding her own fists against the wood. Her face was twisted into a mask of absolute outrage. "Dad, open this door right this second!" Natalie shrieked. Her voice was shrill, cutting through the sound of the rising storm. "You have lost your mind. You cannot lock us out of our own home. My clothes are in there. Cameron's confidential client files are in there. You are holding our personal property hostage." I watched the screen intently. I searched her face for a single ounce of genuine concern for her father. I looked for any sign that she wondered if I was safe or if perhaps her husband's blatant financial theft had finally broken my heart. There was nothing. She was not grieving the loss of her father. She was grieving the loss of her free housing. She was enraged that her personal comfort had been interrupted. She looked down at the 12 heavy cardboard boxes I had stacked neatly on the edge of the porch. The cardboard was beginning to darken and soften under the heavy rain. "Look what you are doing to my things!" Natalie screamed, gesturing wildly at the boxes. "Those are silk dresses. Those are expensive shoes. You are ruining my life. If you do not open this door in the next 5 seconds, I am calling the police. Do you hear me? I will have you arrested for illegal eviction and grand larceny. You have no legal right to do this." Her threats washed over me without leaving a single mark. She was reciting legal terms she did not understand, desperately trying to assert control over a situation she had completely lost. I zoomed the camera in on her face. I saw the daughter I had taught to ride a bicycle. I saw the daughter whose college tuition I had paid in full. I saw the daughter who had stood by in absolute silence while her husband tried to systematically erase my existence and steal my life savings. Blood ties meant nothing when they were used as a garrote. "Call them," I thought, silently watching her pull her cell phone from her purse with trembling, wet fingers. "Call the police. Bring the authorities right to our doorstep. It would save my attorney the trouble of hunting Cameron down to serve him the fraud indictments." Cameron grabbed Natalie's arm, nearly knocking the phone from her grip. "Do not call the cops yet," he hissed, his face pale and desperate. "We do not need the police digging into this. Just help me break a window. We will say he had a mental break and locked us out. We just need to get inside and get the paperwork." He was terrified. He knew exactly what he had done. He knew about the forged power of attorney. He knew about the massive margin calls hanging over his head. He knew that if the police arrived and I handed them the documentation of his felony bank fraud, he would be leaving Chestnut Hill in the back of a squad car. He was begging his wife to help him break into a house to destroy the evidence of his own crimes. Natalie yanked her arm away. "I am wet, I am freezing, and my father has gone completely insane," she yelled back at him. "I am calling the police. He cannot do this. He is just an old man. He does not know what he is doing." She tapped the screen of her phone, her thumb moving frantically. She genuinely believed her own narrative. She had convinced herself that my refusal to be a victim was a symptom of mental decline. She was preparing to lie to the emergency dispatcher, ready to paint me as a dangerous, unstable geriatric in order to regain access to her luxurious lifestyle. They were turning against each other on my front porch, two parasites fighting over a host that had already severed the connection. The rain was falling in thick, heavy sheets now. The water pooled on the stone steps and splashed against the sides of the cardboard boxes containing their entire lives. Cameron kicked the nearest box in a fit of impotent rage. The wet cardboard tore open, spilling a pile of his custom-tailored silk ties and expensive dress shirts directly into a muddy puddle. He stared at his ruined clothes, his chest heaving, his breath visible in the cold night air. He looked like a man who had just watched his empire burn to the ground. I had seen enough. The point had been made. The absolute finality of my decision had been physically manifested. It was time to deliver the closing statement. I reached across the dark mahogany surface of my desk. I pressed my finger against the brushed steel control panel of the master intercom system. The system was wired directly into the high-output security speakers concealed beneath the eaves of the front porch. The speakers were designed to project a clear, commanding voice across the entire property. I held the activation button down. A sharp electronic chime echoed across the porch, instantly cutting through the sound of the torrential rain and their chaotic screaming. Cameron and Natalie froze. They both snapped their heads upward, looking for the source of the noise. Natalie lowered her cell phone. Cameron took a cautious step back from the door, his eyes darting wildly across the brick facade of the house. They looked like startled prey, realizing the hunter was watching them from the trees. I leaned close to the microphone. I did not raise my voice. I did not inject an ounce of anger or sorrow into my tone. I spoke with the cold, absolute authority of a man who owned the ground beneath their feet. "You are trespassing on private property," I said. My voice rolled across the front lawn like thunder. It was magnified and perfectly clear, stripped of any familial warmth. Natalie flinched instinctively, taking a step closer to Cameron. Cameron stared at the front door, his jaw clenched, his fists opening and closing at his sides. Dad, Natalie shouted back at the house, her voice trembling. "Open the door, please. It is freezing out here. You are taking this too far. We can talk about the bedroom. We can talk about everything. Just let us inside." She was trying to negotiate. She was trying to deploy the sweet, pleading voice she had used as a teenager to get her way. She thought this was a simple misunderstanding about a living arrangement. She had no concept of the total financial war her husband had initiated. "There is nothing left to discuss. Natalie." My voice echoed from the speakers, hard and unyielding. "The locks are changed. Your access to my bank accounts is permanently revoked. The utility bills will remain in my name. The forged power of attorney Cameron submitted to the bank this morning has been flagged as felony fraud by my legal team." Cameron visibly recoiled as if he had been struck by lightning. The remaining color drained completely from his face. He looked at Natalie in absolute terror. He had not told her about the forged document. He had not told her about his attempt to steal the entire estate while she slept. Natalie turned to look at her husband, her eyes wide with shock and sudden dawning horror. "Cameron, what is he talking about?" she demanded, grabbing his wetsuit jacket. "What power of attorney? What did you do?" Cameron could not answer. He was paralyzed by the realization that his entire criminal scheme was exposed. The walls were closing in on him rapidly. I did not give them time to argue. I held the intercom button down, delivering the final devastating directive. "You have exactly 3 minutes to remove your trash from my property," I stated calmly. "When those 3 minutes expire, I am activating the perimeter alarm and releasing the security footage to the local police department, along with the fraud indictments. Choose your next move very carefully." I released the button. The microphone clicked off. The heavy, oppressive silence returned to my office. On the monitor, I watched the absolute destruction of their partnership. Natalie screamed at Cameron, hitting him in the chest with her purse, demanding answers he could not give. Cameron ignored her. He looked at the heavy oak door one last time, a look of profound, crushing defeat washing over his face. He knew he was beaten. He dropped to his knees in the pouring rain. He began frantically scooping his ruined silk ties and wet dress shirts from the muddy puddle, shoving them haphazardly back into the torn cardboard box. He was scrambling in the dirt like a beggar. Natalie stood over him, sobbing hysterically into the cold wind, realizing she had traded her father and her inheritance for a desperate, bankrupt fraud. The 3-minute countdown had begun. I leaned back in my leather chair, crossed my arms, and watched the storm wash the last remnants of the parasites off my front porch. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the heavy sheets of rain, illuminating the dark driveway with a frantic, pulsing rhythm. 2 local police cruisers skidded to a halt, just behind Cameron's parked luxury sedan. The arrival of the authorities was the exact escalation Cameron had counted on. He had dialed emergency services in a state of calculated panic, expertly weaving a narrative designed to weaponize the police against me. He had reported a hostile takeover of his property by an unstable, potentially dangerous, elderly relative. Cameron ran toward the first squad car the moment the heavy doors opened. He ignored the freezing rain soaking his ruined suit. He threw his hands up in a gesture of absolute helplessness. He played the role of the victimized executive flawlessly. "Officer, thank God you are here," he shouted over the roar of the storm. "My father-in-law has completely lost his mind. He is experiencing some kind of severe psychotic break. He locked us out in the freezing rain, destroyed our personal property, and he is holding all my sensitive corporate documents hostage inside the house. You have to break the door down and get him out of there before he hurts himself or destroys my firm." Natalie stood a few paces behind him, shivering violently, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest. The cold and the shock had reduced her to a weeping, fragile figure. The officers looked at the wealthy, distressed couple standing in the driveway of a multi-million-dollar estate. They looked at the heavy cardboard boxes, spilling wet silk and leather onto the stone porch. The scene perfectly matched Cameron's fabricated story. A wealthy homeowner locked out by a delirious, unpredictable old man. The lead officer, a tall, imposing man wrapped in a dark rain slicker, nodded sharply. He placed a hand on his utility belt and marched purposefully toward the front porch. His partner followed close behind his posture, tense and alert. They stepped over the ruined boxes of Cameron's clothing. The lead officer approached the heavy oak door. He did not bother to search for a doorbell. He pounded his heavy flashlight against the reinforced wood with immense force. "Calvin Pierce!" The officer commanded, his voice booming with absolute, unquestionable authority. "This is the police. Open this door immediately and step outside with your hands visible. If you refuse to comply, we will treat this as a barricade situation and we will force entry." Cameron stood at the bottom of the steps, a vindictive, triumphant smirk creeping onto his wet face. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed the badges and the guns would shatter the steel fortress he could not break himself. He thought the authorities would drag me out in handcuffs, leaving the estate wide open for him to re-enter and destroy the evidence of his financial crimes. Inside the darkened foyer, the sound of the police demanding entry echoed off the marble floors. I did not flinch. I did not feel a single drop of fear. I stood perfectly still, watching the security monitor. Next to me stood Vincent, my attorney. He had arrived an hour earlier, slipping through the secure secondary garage entrance long before the storm hit its peak. Vincent was an older, impeccably sharp legal mind who moved with the quiet lethality of a shark in deep water. He held a thick, waterproof leather briefcase tightly against his side. Vincent looked at this monitor, observing the aggressive posture of the police officers and the arrogant sneer on Cameron's face. He turned to me and gave a single firm nod. The trap was full. It was time to spring it. I reached out and pressed my thumb against the interior biometric release. The heavy magnetic locks disengaged with a loud, simultaneous mechanical clank that resonated through the porch. The deadbolts retracted. I grasped the handle and pulled the heavy oak door open. The howling wind and the freezing rain rushed into the foyer, but I did not step back. I walked out onto the covered portion of the porch. I was perfectly dry-dressed in a crisp, tailored suit, standing tall and projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. Vincent stepped out right beside me, adjusting his glasses, looking completely unbothered by the armed officers standing on the steps. The lead officer immediately raised his hand, gesturing for me to stop. "Sir, step away from the door," he ordered sharply. "We received a frantic call from the homeowner stating you are experiencing a medical emergency and have barricaded yourself inside his property." Cameron pointed a shaking finger at me from the bottom of the stairs. "Arrest him," he yelled, his voice shrill with fake panic. "He is dangerous. He destroyed my locks and stole my house. Put him in handcuffs right now." I did not look at Cameron. I looked directly into the eyes of the lead officer. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with a clarity that cut cleanly through the noise of the storm. "Good evening, officers," I said. "My name is Calvin Pierce. I am the sole legal owner of this estate. The man screaming at the bottom of my steps is my son-in-law, Cameron Davis. He is a guest whose residency was formally and legally terminated today." The officer frowned, clearly thrown off balance by my composed demeanor. He had expected a confused, rambling old man. Instead, he was facing a man who radiated absolute authority. "Sir," the caller stated, "he owns this property and you locked him out," the officer said, his tone slightly less aggressive, but still suspicious. Vincent stepped forward before the officer could finish his sentence. He did not yell. He simply moved with a commanding presence that demanded immediate attention. "Gentlemen," Vincent said, his voice smooth and incredibly sharp. "My name is Vincent Adler. I am the senior legal counsel representing Mr. Pierce. You have been summoned here under entirely false pretenses by a man attempting to use your badges to bypass a lawful eviction and conceal his own federal crimes." Vincent did not wait for the officers to process his words. He walked straight down the porch steps, stepping directly into the pouring rain. He marched right past Cameron, ignoring him completely, and walked straight to the hood of the nearest flashing police cruiser. The officers turned and followed him, their confusion growing by the second. Cameron trailed behind them, his triumphant smirk faltering as a cold wave of dread washed over him. Vincent opened his waterproof briefcase right on the wet metal hood of the patrol car. He pulled out a thick stack of documents encased in clear plastic sleeves. He slapped the first document onto the hood directly under the glare of the police spotlight. "This is the original notarized property deed," Vincent stated, tapping his finger against the paper. "The sole owner of this multi-million-dollar estate is Calvin Pierce. Cameron Davis has absolutely no legal claim to this property, no equity, and no tenant rights. He was a guest. Mr. Pierce formally terminated that status this morning." The lead officer leaned over, shining his flashlight onto the document. He read the names clearly printed on the deed. He looked back at Cameron, his eyes narrowing. Cameron swallowed hard, his throat suddenly completely dry. "Wait," Cameron stammered, raising his hands. "That does not matter. He cannot just throw us out into the street without 30 days' notice. I have rights." Vincent pulled a second document from his briefcase and slammed it onto the hood right next to the deed. "This is an emergency court-ordered eviction mandate and a permanent restraining order signed by a Superior Court judge not 2 hours ago," Vincent said, his voice rising like the crack of a whip. "Mr. Davis forfeited any standard tenant rights the moment he committed felony fraud against my client." The word fraud hung in the wet, heavy air. The second police officer instinctively rested his hand on his radio, his posture shifting from annoyed peacekeeper to active law enforcement. "What fraud?" the lead officer asked, his gaze completely locked on Vincent now. Vincent pulled out the final, most devastating pieces of evidence. He laid out the bank statements, the transaction logs, and the printed copy of the power of attorney document that Cameron had submitted the night before. This morning, Vincent explained, pointing to the highlighted sections, Mr. Davis submitted a forged power of attorney to Mr. Pierce's primary financial institution. He attempted to declare my client mentally incompetent in order to seize absolute control of Mr. Pierce's entire estate and liquidate his massive cash reserves. Natalie let out a choked, horrifying gasp. She stumbled forward, grabbing the side of the police car to keep herself from collapsing. She stared at the documents illuminated by the flashlight. She saw her father's forged signature, She saw the unbelievable sum of money her husband had tried to steal in the dead of night. Cameron. She whispered, her voice completely broken. You tried to steal his money. You forged his signature. Cameron was cornered. There was no charm, no manipulation, no expensive suit that could save him now. He looked at the police officers, his eyes wide and frantic. He looked at his wife, who was staring at him as if he were a monster. He looked back at me, standing tall and silent on the porch of the house he had tried to steal. Those documents are fake, Cameron yelled, panic fully consuming him. He is making all of this up to ruin me. I am a senior executive. I manage millions of dollars. I would never do something like this. You have to believe me. Vincent did not even look at him. He kept his eyes on the lead officer. Attached to the back of that packet is the official forensic flag from the bank's Central Fraud Division. Vincent said, his tone utterly merciless. They have already frozen his accounts and launched a formal investigation. The FBI field office has been notified of the wire fraud attempt. Mr. Davis did not call you here because he was illegally locked out. He called you here hoping you would force entry so he could physically destroy these documents before I could serve them to the authorities. The lead officer finished reading the bank's fraud report. He picked up the judge's restraining order and reviewed the signature. He slowly folded the papers, handed them back to Vincent, and turned to face Cameron. The dynamic had completely shifted. The officer was no longer looking at a wealthy victim. He was looking at a desperate, cornered felon. Mr. Davis, the officer said, his voice stripped of all previous politeness. According to this valid judge-signed order, you are currently trespassing on this property. You are also explicitly forbidden from coming within 500 feet of Mr. Pierce. Cameron took a stumbling step backward, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Officer, please, you do not understand. I just need my things. I just need to get my laptop and my files. Your personal effects have been boxed and placed on the edge of the property line by the front gate, I called out from the porch. The sound of my voice made Cameron flinch. You have absolutely no reason to remain on this driveway. The lead officer unclipped his handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click echoed sharply through the rain. Sir, the officer commanded, stepping directly toward Cameron. I am ordering you to vacate this premises immediately. If you take one step toward that house, or if you refuse to leave this driveway right now, you will be placed under arrest for criminal trespassing and violating a superior court protective order. Cameron stood frozen in the rain, stripped of his power, his wealth, and his dignity. The illusion was dead. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Natalie sobbing, turning her back on her husband, and walking slowly toward the front gates alone. I stood on the porch watching the police officers physically escort the man who tried to destroy me off my property forever. The lead officer turned his back on the house and faced Cameron. His stance had shifted entirely. He was no longer dealing with a distressed homeowner. He was dealing with a trespasser who had just lied to an officer of the law. He held Vincent's documents in his left hand and rested his right hand near his radio. The flashing red and blue lights of the patrol car painted the heavy rain in frantic bursts of color. Mr. Davis, the officer said. His voice was hard and flat. I need to see your proof of ownership. I need a deed, a lease agreement, or any legally binding document that proves you have a right to stand on this driveway. Cameron opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the officer, then down at the rain-slicked asphalt. The confident executive posture he had relied on for years completely dissolved. He raised his hands in a frantic, placating gesture. Officer, you have to understand, he stammered, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. My files are inside. The old man locked me out before I could grab my briefcase. My name is on the secondary accounts. I manage this estate. He is just confused. He is having a severe episode. The officer stepped closer to Cameron. The rain continued to pour, but the tension in the air made the cold weather irrelevant. Sir, that is not what I asked, the officer stated. This document from the Superior Court explicitly terminates your residency. It also details a forged power of attorney submitted to a federal bank this morning. Do you have any proof to counter this court order? Yes or no? Before Cameron could formulate another lie, Vincent moved. The lawyer walked up to the edge of the police cruiser. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His tone was razor-sharp, cutting through the sound of the storm with brutal precision. He does not have proof, Officer Vincent said calmly, because his entire life is a fabrication. Mr. Davis is not a successful executive. His consulting firm is entirely bankrupt. He is currently facing massive margin calls that he cannot pay. He forged my client's signature this morning in a desperate attempt to liquidate a lifetime of savings to cover his own catastrophic debts in the stock market. Natalie let out a sharp gasp. She had been standing near the edge of the driveway, wrapping her arms around herself to ward off the cold. Now she stood perfectly still. Her eyes darted from Vincent to Cameron. The pieces of the puzzle were violently snapping into place in her mind. The sudden rush to get married. The constant questions about her father's health and his investment accounts. The insistence that they move into the estate to save money while their own luxury condo was allegedly being renovated. It had all been a calculated play for survival, Natalie whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the rain, but it carried a weight that made everyone turn. Cameron looked at her, his eyes wide with absolute animal panic. He saw the recognition dawning on her face. The perfect mask he had worn for 3 years was cracking apart, exposing the desperate fraud underneath. Natalie took a step toward him. Her expensive shoes splashed in the muddy puddles forming on the driveway. "Are you broke?" she asked, her voice rising in pitch, thick with horror. "Did you fake the power of attorney? Tell me the truth right now. Did you try to steal from my father to pay your debts?" Cameron reached out to her, his hands shaking violently. "Nat, honey, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "He is setting me up. Your father never liked me. He fabricated these documents to ruin us. We are a team. You have to believe me. We can fight this together. Just tell the police he is sick. Tell them he belongs in a medical facility." Natalie stared at the man she had married. She saw the terrified liar hiding beneath the ruined Italian suit. She remembered how easily he had talked about moving her father into the basement. She remembered the cold calculation in his eyes when he evaluated the antique furniture in the living room. He had never loved her. She was simply the key to the vault. A wave of profound nausea washed over her. "Do not touch me," she screamed, stepping back so quickly she nearly tripped over her own feet. "You used me. You wanted me to put my own father in a home so you could steal his money. You are a complete fraud." She covered her mouth with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The illusion of her high society life was entirely shattered. She was left standing in the freezing rain, married to a criminal with no money and no future. Vincent adjusted his glasses and looked at the police officers. The humiliation was complete, but the law required finality. "Gentlemen," Vincent said smoothly, regaining control of the scene. "I have already forwarded the bank's fraud report to the federal authorities. Given the staggering amount of money Mr. Davis attempted to wire out of state this morning, the FBI field office has taken jurisdiction. A federal arrest warrant is currently being drafted. If he attempts to flee or cause a disturbance, it will only accelerate that process." The lead officer nodded. He understood the gravity of the situation. He turned his full attention back to Cameron. The dynamic had completely shifted. This was no longer a domestic dispute between family members. This was a secured crime scene, and Cameron was the primary target. "Mr. Davis," the officer commanded, pointing a stern finger toward the heavy iron gates at the end of the long driveway. "You're going to turn around and walk off this property immediately. You are not going to take those boxes. You are not going to approach that house. You will wait on the public sidewalk until you secure your own transportation. If you cross the property line, you will spend the night in a holding cell." "Do I make myself clear?" Cameron looked at the officer. He looked at the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the wet pavement. He looked at Natalie, who was shaking her head and refusing to even look in his direction. Finally, he looked at the house. He looked at the dark reinforced window where he knew I was sitting. There was no rage left in him. The adrenaline had burned out, leaving nothing but cold, crushing reality. There was only the hollow, vacant stare of a man who knew his life was effectively over. He turned his back on the estate. He dragged his feet across the asphalt, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. He walked past the ruined cardboard boxes containing his expensive, muddy clothes. He walked past his luxury car, knowing it would soon be repossessed by the bank. He stepped through the iron gates and stood alone in the dark, swallowed by the pouring rain. The lead officer turned back to Vincent. He handed the waterproof folder back to the lawyer. "Everything seems to be in order here, sir," the officer said quietly. "We will remain on site for a while to ensure he leaves the neighborhood. Contact us immediately if he returns or causes any further trouble." Vincent thanked the officers with a polite nod. He turned and walked back up the stone steps, stepping carefully around the debris. I pressed the button on my desk. The heavy oak door opened with a quiet mechanical hum. Vincent stepped inside out of the storm, wiping the rain from his coat. The reinforced door locked securely behind him with a heavy, satisfying thud. The show was over. Order had been restored. The fortress was secure. The lead officer did not wait for Cameron to offer another pathetic excuse. He grabbed Cameron firmly by the shoulder, spinning him around, with professional, unyielding force, and pressing him flat against the slick, wet metal of the police cruiser. Cameron gasped loudly, his chest heaving against the freezing steel as the officer pulled his arms forcefully behind his back. The sharp, metallic snap of the handcuffs, cutting through the heavy sound of the pouring rain, was the absolute loudest noise in the world. Cameron squirmed and thrashed completely, abandoning his sophisticated, untouchable persona. He cried out in genuine terror, begging the officers, begging his wife, begging the empty night air. He screamed that he was a successful victim, that the federal bank had made a terrible clerical error, that my attorney Vincent had maliciously fabricated the documents to destroy his reputation. The second officer ignored the frantic babbling. He simply pushed Cameron's head down, guiding the ruined executive roughly into the back seat of the patrol car. The heavy reinforced door slammed shut with a deafening thud, trapping Cameron behind thick security glass and wire mesh. Natalie stood entirely paralyzed on the edge of the driveway. She watched the flashing red and blue lights paint her husband's terrified, weeping face through the rain-streaked window. He looked incredibly small. He looked exactly like the pathetic, bankrupt criminal he truly was. The lead officer turned his attention to Natalie. He informed her with cold efficiency that Cameron was being transported to the downtown precinct for immediate processing regarding the forged federal documents and the attempted wire fraud. He told her she was not currently under arrest, but she was still strictly bound by the parameters of the judge-signed eviction mandate. She had to vacate the property immediately or face identical trespassing charges. The officer tipped his rain-saturated hat, got into the driver's seat, and put the heavy cruiser in gear. The two police vehicles pulled out of the driveway, their tires hissing aggressively against the wet asphalt. The massive wrought iron gates swung shut behind them, locking with a heavy final clank that echoed like a prison door sealing shut. Natalie was left entirely alone. The violent storm raged around her, merciless and freezing. The wind whipped her soaked hair fiercely across her face, stinging her pale cheeks. Her incredibly expensive silk designer dress clung to her shivering body, ruined by the splattering mud and the driving rain. She looked down at the driveway in absolute horror. The 12 heavy cardboard boxes I had packed were rapidly disintegrating in the deep puddles. The thick industrial shipping tape was peeling away from the soaked cardboard, allowing the heavy rain to flood directly into the boxes. She watched helplessly as a pristine leather handbag filled with dirty brown water. Her custom silk blouses and tailored skirts spilled out onto the rough asphalt, plastered to the ground like discarded rags. Her entire world, the grand kingdom of privilege and entitlement she believed she was inherently owed, was reduced to a pile of soggy garbage on a dark driveway. She had no car. She had no credit cards. She had no husband to provide the illusion of endless success. She had absolutely nothing but the wet clothes on her back. The crushing reality of her destitution hit her with brutal physical force. Her knees buckled beneath her. She dropped to the wet flagstone path, the rough stone biting sharply into her bare skin. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, crawling pathetically through the freezing mud toward the massive oak door of my fortified home. This was the exact same door she had proudly strutted through yesterday, fully believing she was the new master of the estate, ready to banish me to the basement. She reached the front porch, her hands trembling violently as she pulled herself up against the reinforced doorframe. She stared directly into the glowing red lens of the security camera mounted above the biometric scanner. She knew I was watching. She knew I was listening to every single breath she took. "Dad." She screamed, her voice tearing harshly through the howling wind. "Dad, please open the door. I am freezing out here. I am terrified. Please do not leave me out here in the dark like an animal." She pressed her wet, tear-streaked face against the cold polycarbonate glass of the front window. She slapped her palms frantically against the unbreakable surface, leaving frantic, muddy handprints across the pristine pane. She was crying hysterically, abandoning every ounce of dignity she possessed. "You cannot do this to me," she wailed, her voice echoing across the empty porch. "I am your daughter. I am your little girl. You are supposed to protect me from things like this." I did not know what Cameron was doing. I swear to you on my life I did not know about the forged bank documents. He lied to me. He manipulated me just like he manipulated everyone else in the world. I am a victim in this tragedy too. She slid down the glass, collapsing entirely onto the porch floor, hugging her knees tightly to her chest. She continued to sob, deciding to deploy the ultimate weapon she believed she possessed against me. She chose to weaponize our shared history and our blood bond. "But I am your family," she cried, her voice cracking with manufactured desperation. "We are blood. You have to forgive me. I was just trying to do what was best for our future. Last night when we talked about the nursing home and selling the house, I was just so worried about your declining health. Cameron convinced me you were losing your mind and becoming a danger to yourself. I was just scared for you. I love you, Dad. I love you so much. Please just let me come home." I sat perfectly still in the darkness of my office, watching her pathetic, calculated performance on the high-definition monitor. I listened to the raw desperation in her voice, parsing the lies from the genuine panic. A few months ago, those tears would have broken my heart into a million pieces. A few months ago, I would have rushed blindly to the front door, thrown it wide open, and wrapped my heavy wool coat around her shivering shoulders. I would have eagerly believed her lies because a father desperately wants to believe the absolute best about his own child. But the man who would have saved her died the moment I heard her laughing with Cameron about locking me away in a cheap, sterile medical facility. The man who would have saved her died the exact moment I realized she viewed my entire existence as a temporary, annoying obstacle blocking her access to my bank accounts. Her tears were not born of remorse. They were born of massive inconvenience. I reached across my desk and pressed my finger firmly against the heavy steel button on the master intercom console. The sharp electronic chime cut violently through the sound of the storm, silencing Natalie instantly. She scrambled to her knees, looking up at the speaker, hidden beneath the porch eaves, her eyes wide with sudden, desperate hope. She thought her manipulation had worked. "Natalie," I said, my voice projecting across the porch with absolute chilling clarity. "Do not dare invoke the concept of family to justify your incredible cruelty. You traded the values of this family for a wardrobe of silk and a lying, bankrupt husband." She flinched violently, as if my words were physical blows. "Dad, please," she whimpered, raising a trembling hand toward the speaker. I did not stop. "You claim you did not know about the forged banking documents?" I continued, my tone completely devoid of warmth or hesitation. "Perhaps that specific detail is true. But you knew exactly what you were doing last night. You sat at my dining table eating the food I bought, and calculated the exact financial cost of locking me away in a facility. You looked me directly in the eye and told me I was a burden. You did not want to protect me. You wanted to discard me so you could claim your inheritance without waiting for my natural death. You stood by and watched your husband try to erase me. Natalie stared at this camera lens, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, entirely unable to formulate a single coherent excuse. The terrible, undeniable truth hung heavily in the freezing air between us. She had been perfectly willing to execute a hostile, remorseless takeover of my life. She was only crying now because her grand plan had failed spectacularly, and the brutal consequences had finally arrived at her feet. She raised both hands toward the camera, her face contorted in a mask of absolute crushing misery. "Dad, please," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the pounding rain. "I made a terrible mistake. I am your family. I am your daughter. You have to let me in." I held the intercom button down one final time. My heart was completely steady. My mind was perfectly clear, free of the suffocating fog of paternal guilt that had clouded my judgment for 3 long years. I felt absolutely no anger, only the profound, silent peace of a man who had finally excised a lethal poison from his life. In this house, we only welcome those with conscience and gratitude. I stated, my voice echoing like a judge handing down a final, irrevocable sentence. "You made your choice, Natalie." I released the button. The intercom clicked off, plunging the audio feed into dead, absolute silence. I reached across the desk and flipped the main power switch for the exterior porch lights. The heavy, suffocating shadows instantly swallowed the front of the estate. Natalie was left kneeling in total darkness, completely surrounded by the ruined, muddy cardboard boxes of her shattered life. The storm roared on violently, indifferent to her weeping. I turned away from the glowing security monitors and walked quietly up the stairs, finally ready to sleep in absolute peace. 3 months is a remarkably short time for an empire of lies to completely disintegrate into ash. Without my silent financial backing, Cameron's prestigious consulting firm collapsed with spectacular and public violence. The sudden withdrawal of my guarantor status triggered an immediate cascade of catastrophic defaults across all his commercial accounts. His creditors descended upon his life like starving wolves. His luxury vehicles were repossessed from the street in broad daylight, while his wealthy neighbors watched. The prestigious corner office with the panoramic view of the Boston skyline was stripped to the bare drywall by the end of the first month. But the financial ruin was only the quiet beginning of his absolute nightmare. The federal authorities had taken the forged power of attorney incredibly seriously. The paper trail he had arrogantly left behind in the bank's digital portal was an undeniable map of felony wire fraud. Cameron was no longer wearing bespoke Italian suits or dining in private mahogany rooms. He was wearing bright county-issued clothing. He was spending his days sitting in sterile, windowless interrogation rooms under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. He was desperately trying to negotiate a plea deal with federal prosecutors to avoid a mandatory 20-year prison sentence. His former business partners had completely abandoned him, turning state's evidence to save their own careers. He had bet his entire existence on outsmarting a quiet old carpenter, and he had lost absolutely everything. Natalie did not fare much better in the bitter aftermath of the storm. The flawless illusion of her high society life had been painfully shattered, leaving her standing alone in the toxic rubble of her own entitlement. When the federal government and the aggressive bank lawyers seized their shared assets to cover Cameron's massive margin calls and restitution fines, Natalie was left with virtually nothing. She possessed only the wet clothes and damaged shoes I had packed into those cardboard boxes on the night of the storm. Stripped of her credit cards and her manufactured status, she was forced to sign a strict lease on a cramped, dimly lit one-bedroom apartment on the extreme industrial outskirts of the city. It was a decaying neighborhood where police sirens wailed continuously through the night, and the ancient iron radiators hissed with a terrifying metallic rattle. She had never known a single day of physical labor or financial anxiety in her entire life. Now she was working 2 exhausting, soul-crushing minimum wage jobs just to keep the electricity turned on and to chip away at the mountain of secondary debt Cameron had legally tethered to her name. She spent her early mornings pouring scalding coffee for rude, impatient commuters, and her late evenings folding heavy denim clothes in a dusty retail stockroom. The irony of her situation was incredibly profound. I had spent 40 years breaking my back on freezing construction sites, specifically so my daughter would never have to know the bone-deep, aching exhaustion of manual labor. I had paid her expensive university tuition in full so she could start her adult life completely unburdened by loans. I had given her a life of pure comfort, and in return, she had viewed me as a disposable resource. Now she was living the exact life of hardship I had sacrificed my own youth to protect her from. She was learning the true, unforgiving weight of a single dollar earned through physical pain. She was learning that the harsh world outside the protective, fortified walls of my estate did not care at all about her designer tastes or her manufactured social status. The universe was exacting a brutal, silent tuition for her education in reality. It was late on a freezing, rainy Tuesday evening when Natalie finally returned to her small apartment. Her feet throbbed with a dull ache, and her hands were dry and cracked from washing industrial coffee pots with harsh chemicals. She unlocked her thin wooden door and walked into the narrow, unheated kitchen. Resting directly in the center of her small laminate dining table was a thick, pristine white envelope. It had been delivered by a bonded private courier service. She instantly recognized the elegant, heavily embossed seal of Vincent Adler's law firm stamped into the corner. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she picked it up. She tore the heavy paper open with trembling, exhausted fingers. Inside the envelope, she found two distinct items. The first was a certified cashier's check drawn from my personal account. It was drafted for exactly $2,000. It was a precise, coldly calculated amount, exactly enough to cover her first month of rent and a few weeks of basic groceries. It was a lifeline, but it was absolutely not an invitation to return to luxury. It was the bare minimum required for basic human survival. It was the exact amount of money she and Cameron had once casually spent on a single weekend dinner downtown. Now, holding that small piece of printed paper, she looked at it as if it were a miraculous fortune. The second item in the envelope was a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy, intimidating stock paper. Natalie slowly unfolded the pages. The title at the top of the first page was printed in bold, uncompromising black letters. It read, "Voluntary Renunciation of Inheritance Rights." The document was an ironclad, legally binding contract drafted by Vincent with ruthless precision. It explicitly outlined that by accepting and cashing the enclosed check, Natalie formally, permanently, and irrevocably surrendered any future claim to my estate, my liquid assets, my trusts, and my physical properties. It stated in plain, brutal language that she acknowledged her active role in the attempted financial abuse against me. It declared that she was permanently severed from my bloodline regarding all legal matters of inheritance. Natalie sank heavily into the cheap plastic chair in her tiny kitchen. She stared at the contract, hot tears welling in her tired eyes and spilling over her pale cheeks. She was not crying out of anger or vindictive rage. She was crying from the crushing, irreversible weight of absolute regret. She finally realized in that quiet, miserable apartment that I was not trying to maliciously destroy her. I was forcing her to face the brutal, uncompromising consequences of her own choices. I was offering her a final, permanent choice. She could refuse the money fight, a completely losing battle in probate court, and continue to drown slowly in her husband's toxic debts. Or she could sign the paper, take the small financial lifeline I had offered, and completely walk away from the empire she had tried to steal. She reached for a cheap ballpoint pen resting on the counter. Her hand shook violently, but she pressed the ink to the paper and signed her name on the dotted line, trading her grand illusions for a simple month of survival. Back at the estate in Chestnut Hill, the house was perfectly quiet and comfortably warm. I sat in my home office reading the final digital confirmation email from Vincent. Natalie had signed the document in the presence of a mobile notary. She had cashed the check at a local bank branch. The legal and financial tether between us was permanently severed. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and looked out the reinforced polycarbonate window at the calm, starlit night. I felt no triumphant joy. I felt no vindictive thrill of victory. I felt only a profound, settling peace. The cancer had been cleanly and efficiently excised from my life. The wealth I had spent a lifetime building was completely secure behind a wall of steel and law. I had lost a daughter to the blinding disease of greed, but I had reclaimed my own dignity. The fortress was quiet, the wolves were gone, and the heavy doors of my home would remain firmly locked to anyone who mistook a father's quiet kindness for weakness. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed softly, marking the arrival of evening at the Chestnut Hill estate. 3 months had passed since the violent storm washed the last traces of betrayal from my front porch. The heavy oak door remained firmly shut, but it no longer felt like a barricade against an invading force. It was simply a door protecting a quiet and peaceful home. I walked through the pristine foyer, my footsteps echoing lightly against the polished marble floor. There was a profound stillness in the air. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of loneliness that I had feared after my wife passed away. It was the crisp, clean silence of absolute liberation. The house breathed easily, completely purged of the toxic, calculating energy that Cameron and Natalie had tracked inside with their expensive shoes. I made my way to the kitchen, the room where I had once listened to them whisper about my mental decline. I filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove. The gentle hum of the heating water was the only sound in the vast room. I prepared a simple cup of chamomile tea, finding immense joy in the quiet rhythm of the task. No one was standing over my shoulder complaining about the smell of the herbs or demanding that I hire a private chef to cater to their refined tastes. The scent of the chamomile filled the room, replacing the cloying, heavy perfumes Natalie used to spray in the hallways. I remembered how she used to march through these rooms mentally, cataloging my possessions, dividing up my legacy while I was still drawing breath. She had looked at my home not as a sanctuary of memories, but as a vast checking account waiting to be drained. Now those greedy eyes were gone. The air was entirely mine to breathe. I carried the warm porcelain cup through the house, pausing to turn on a few soft amber lamps. The soft glow illuminated the antique furniture and the framed photographs on the walls. The house was exactly as I wanted it to be. It belonged entirely to me again. Every room, every hallway, every piece of art was a reflection of my life and my choices. I walked into my study and settled into my favorite leather armchair. The leather was worn and incredibly comfortable, molded perfectly to my shape over years of use. It was the same chair Natalie had once suggested I throw away to make room for modern minimalist furniture. I sank into the cushions, letting the warmth of the tea spread through my chest. I reached for the remote control resting on the mahogany side table. I pressed the power button and the large television screen flickered to life. I selected a historical documentary about ancient Roman architecture. I adjusted the volume, setting it to a level that was perfectly comfortable for my ears. I did not have to worry about the sound bothering anyone upstairs. I did not have to wear headphones to accommodate a demanding son-in-law who claimed he needed absolute silence to conduct his fraudulent business deals. I had the complete, unadulterated luxury of living in my own space on my own terms. As the narrator on the screen described the building of ancient fortresses, my mind drifted briefly to the events of the past 3 months. I thought about the white envelope Vincent had delivered to that cramped, freezing apartment on the industrial edge of the city. I thought about the signed contract resting securely in my safe, the final legal document that permanently severed the tie between a father and a daughter who had chosen greed over love. I felt a fleeting moment of sorrow for the innocent little girl Natalie used to be, but that sorrow did not extend to the cruel, entitled woman she had chosen to become. I had given her exactly what she earned. I had paid her tuition in the harsh school of reality. The crushing burden of her new life, the multiple minimum wage jobs, the absolute loss of her social status, none of it was my responsibility. She and Cameron had built their own trap, and they were now locked inside it. People in the neighborhood might whisper about the old man who threw his only daughter out into the street. They might gossip at their dinner parties, shaking their heads at my supposed cruelty. They did not know about the forged power of attorney. They did not know about the midnight plans to lock me away in a sterile facility. They did not know the sheer terror of realizing that the people sleeping under your roof are actively plotting your destruction. I did not care about their whispers. Their opinions could not penetrate the thick walls of my home. I had survived a hostile takeover of my own life, and I had emerged completely victorious. I had reclaimed my dignity from the jaws of their ambition. I had traded the illusion of a loving family for the absolute reality of my own safety. I took a slow, deep sip of my tea, letting the chamomile soothe my senses. I looked away from the television screen and gazed out the reinforced polycarbonate window. The heavy iron gates at the end of the long driveway stood tall and unyielding against the night sky. The security cameras glowed with a faint, steady red light, acting as silent sentinels guarding the perimeter of my estate. The boundary I had drawn was absolute and unbreakable. It was a fortress made of steel glass and ironclad legal documents designed to keep out the parasites and the opportunists. But more importantly, it was a boundary of the heart. I had finally learned that blood relation does not excuse abuse and that true peace can only be achieved by refusing to harbor those who view your kindness as a weakness to be exploited. The documentary continued to play in the background, a steady, comforting murmur in the warm room. I leaned my head back against the leather chair and closed my eyes. There was no more fighting. There was no more pretending. There was no more waiting for the next betrayal to drop. The long, exhausting war was definitively over. The house had reclaimed its original soul, standing strong and silent in the dark. I took one last breath of the quiet air, feeling a profound and unshakable contentment settle deep into my bones. The story of Calvin Pierce teaches us a profound lesson about the true nature of family and the absolute necessity of personal boundaries. Blood relations do not grant anyone the right to exploit, manipulate, or abuse a parent's generosity. We often confuse unconditional love with endless tolerance, but true wisdom lies in recognizing when a relationship has become a toxic, parasitic transaction. Setting firm, undeniable boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but an act of self-preservation and profound self-respect. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for an entitled person is to completely remove your safety net and force them to face the brutal reality of their own actions. True wealth is not measured in bank accounts, but in the quiet, unshakable peace of a life lived on your own terms. If you found value in this story of reclaiming dignity and setting boundaries, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more powerful life lessons.